She stood on the train platform, letter clutched in one hand, trunk at her feet. A woman whose worth had been measured in books and dismissed as too much. The telegram that had greeted Charlotte Harlow upon her arrival in Aspen Grove said everything in its brutal brevity. Arrangement terminated. Bride 2 educated for practical use. Return east immediately. But Charlotte had sold everything to come west. There was no immediately to return to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun stretched Charlotte's shadow across the weathered planks of Aspen Grove's train platform as she contemplated her next move. Boston was a memory as faded as the blue of her traveling dress. 3 days on a train had seen to that. Her fingers traced the edges of her credentials, a master's degree in literature, 5 years as university librarian, letters of recommendation that now seemed as useful as pressed flowers. "You waiting on somebody?" The stationmaster's question carried no real interest, just the impatience of a man ready to lock up for the day. "No," Charlotte replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "It seems nobody is waiting on me either." The stationmaster scratched at his beard. "Stage for Pine Ridge leaves in 20 minutes. Only other place within 50 miles, unless you've got horse sense." Charlotte had never ridden a horse in her life. What she did have was $17, a trunk of books, and the stubborn pride that had driven her father to call her impossible and her former fiancé to declare her unmarriageable. She'd come too far to surrender to the first rejection. Pine Ridge then, she decided, purchasing a ticket with coins counted carefully from her dwindling purse. The stagecoach rattled and heaved over terrain that seemed designed to test both axles and passengers. Charlotte sat across from a woman who kept glancing at her gloved hands with undisguised curiosity. "You don't have the look of someone heading to Pine Ridge by choice," the woman finally said. Charlotte considered lying but found she lacked the energy. "My arrangement fell through." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Arrangement?" "I was to marry Samuel Wilson of Aspen Grove. He'd advertised for a bride to help with his general store and children. But upon my arrival, I received word that he found me—" Charlotte hesitated, the words still stinging. "Unsuitable." "Ah!" The woman nodded with newfound understanding. "Mail order situation gone sour. Not the first time." She studied Charlotte more carefully. "I'm Sarah Miller. My husband runs the livery in Pine Ridge." Charlotte Harlow, former librarian, apparently overqualified for marriage. Sarah's laugh was unexpected and warm. "Well, Miss Harlow, Pine Ridge isn't much, but it's got rooms to let above the mercantile, and folks who mind their business. Mostly." Pine Ridge appeared suddenly as the stagecoach crested a hill. A cluster of wooden structures cupped in the palm of a valley, with mountains rising up behind like protective fingers. It was smaller than Charlotte had imagined, just one main street with buildings shouldering each other for space and scattered homesteads visible in the distance. The stagecoach deposited Charlotte and her trunk outside the Pine Ridge Mercantile just as the day's light began to soften. Sarah Miller gave her directions to Mrs. Patton's rooms before hurrying home to her children. Charlotte felt the weight of curious stares as she negotiated for lodging and carried her smaller bag upstairs, leaving her trunk to be fetched later. The room was plain but clean. A narrow bed, washstand, small table, and single chair. The window overlooked the main street, offering Charlotte her first real view of the town that would either become her salvation or her final defeat. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and allowed herself one moment of doubt before squaring her shoulders. Boston had taught her that education was power. Aspen Grove had suggested it was a liability. Pine Ridge would have to be where she discovered what it truly was. Morning arrived with the sounds of a town coming to life. wagon wheels on packed dirt, the distant lowing of cattle, voices calling greetings across the street. Charlotte dressed with care in her second-best outfit, arranged her hair simply, but neatly, and descended to begin her campaign. The mercantile owner, Mr. Abernathy, listened to her request for employment with obvious skepticism. "We don't get much call for," he gestured vaguely at her entire person, "book learning here." "I can count, organize, and manage inventory," Charlotte pressed, keeping her voice level. "Surely those skills translate beyond libraries." "Got my wife and daughter for that," he replied, turning away to help a customer. The same response, with variations, greeted her at the post office, the hotel, and even the schoolhouse, where the teacher, a tired-looking man named Peterson, informed her that the town could barely afford one teacher, let alone an assistant. By midday, Charlotte found herself seated on a bench outside the meeting house, trying to marshal her thoughts. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find a tall man with sun-weathered skin watching her with undisguised curiosity. "You're causing quite a stir," he said, his voice deep and roughened by outdoor living. "Not every day Pine Ridge gets a Boston librarian looking for work." Charlotte sighed. "News travels quickly here. Town's got 3 exports: cattle, timber, and gossip. Last one travels fastest." He extended a work-hardened hand. "Thomas Reed, I run the smithy." "Charlotte Harlow." She accepted his handshake, noting the strength in his grip and the unexpected gentleness with which he applied it. "And apparently, I'm now the town's most interesting failure." "Failure?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Day's only half done." Before Charlotte could respond, the meeting house doors opened and a formidable woman emerged, her grey hair arranged immaculately beneath a hat that spoke of tasteful expense. She surveyed Charlotte with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to making swift judgments. "You must be Miss Harlow," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I'm Eleanor Montgomery. My late husband founded this town." Charlotte rose and offered a polite greeting, acutely aware of her increasingly desperate situation. "I understand you're seeking employment," Mrs. Montgomery continued. "How fortunate. The Ladies' Aid Society was just discussing the need for someone to organize our modest library collection. We couldn't possibly offer much compensation, of course, just a small stipend and perhaps meals at my table while you find your footing." It was charity, thinly disguised as opportunity, but Charlotte had few options. "That's very kind, Mrs. Montgomery." "Excellent. You'll start tomorrow, 9 o'clock sharp." The older woman nodded to Thomas with cool politeness. "Mr. Reed." As Mrs. Montgomery departed, Thomas gave Charlotte a look that held both amusement and warning. "Congratulations, you've been collected." Collected? Mrs. Montgomery collects causes, strays, people she can help just enough to establish her benevolence without disturbing the natural order of things. Charlotte bristled slightly. "I'm not a cause. I'm a qualified professional temporarily inconvenienced." Thomas's smile held no mockery. "Then you'll be the first person in Pine Ridge to outgrow her charity. I look forward to seeing it." He tipped his hat and continued down the street, leaving Charlotte to wonder if she'd found an ally or simply another spectator to her struggle. The modest library collection proved to be 3 shelves of haphazardly arranged books in a back room of the meeting house, mostly worn Bibles, outdated agricultural guides, and a scattered selection of novels deemed appropriate for frontier sensibilities. Charlotte spent her first day simply creating an inventory, her heart sinking at the meager materials, but her mind already formulating plans for organization and possible expansion. Dinner at the Montgomery home that evening was an education in town dynamics. Mrs. Montgomery presided over a table that included Sheriff Winters, Widow Jenkins, and the Millers, whom Charlotte was relieved to see. The conversation flowed around her, touching on town business, upcoming events, and, inevitably, the newest arrival. Miss Harlow was university-trained in Boston, Mrs. Montgomery announced as though introducing an exotic specimen. Such a shame about her situation in Aspen Grove. Men out here simply don't appreciate refinement as they should. Charlotte felt the weight of evaluation in every glance. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute my skills, however modestly," she said carefully. Sheriff Winters studied her with the neutral assessment of a man who made his living judging potential threats. "Don't see many educated women choosing frontier life voluntarily." "I'm not sure necessity constitutes choice, Sheriff," Charlotte replied. "But I've always believed adaptability is the true measure of education." "A lovely sentiment," Widow Jenkins said with a thin smile, "though practical skills tend to serve better than sentiments when winter comes." Sarah Miller jumped in with welcome warmth. "Speaking of practical, Charlotte helped Matthew with his reading this afternoon. He's been struggling with that McGuffey reader for weeks, but she had him sounding out words in no time." Charlotte hadn't expected this support and felt a rush of gratitude towards Sarah. The conversation shifted, but the scrutiny remained. She was being measured against some invisible standard, too educated for a mail-order arrangement, yet not quite fitting the mold of Pine Ridge propriety. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As days stretched into a week, then two, Charlotte established a routine. Mornings were spent in the tiny library. Afternoons often included informal reading lessons for Sarah's children, and occasionally others who began to trickle in, curious, about the book lady from Boston. Evenings brought dinner at the Montgomery table, where Charlotte grew increasingly aware of the boundaries of her role as the town's respectable charity case. It was during her third week that Charlotte's path first crossed meaningfully with Emmett Burke's. She had ventured beyond the town center to deliver a borrowed book to the Miller home, and was returning along the creek path when she encountered a man struggling with a fractious horse. The animal reared and twisted, nearly breaking free of the man's grip on its lead rope. Without thinking, Charlotte called out, "Lower your energy! You're feeding his panic!" The man shot her an incredulous look, but had no time to respond as the horse lunged again. Charlotte set her book bag down and approached slowly, her voice dropping to a calm, steady tone. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand for the rope. The man, whom she now recognized as one of the ranchers who occasionally came to town, hesitated, then grudgingly handed over the lead. Charlotte didn't pull or yank. She stood still, breathing deeply, allowing the rope to maintain connection, without tension. "I grew up near the carriage houses in Boston," she explained quietly. "The grooms taught me that horses reflect our expectations. Expect fight, get fight." Gradually, the horse settled, its breathing synchronizing with hers. When it finally lowered its head, the man looked at Charlotte with reluctant reassessment. "Wouldn't have figured a city woman for horse sense," he said. "There are many kinds of sense, Mr. Burke, Emmett Burke." He took the now calm lead rope back. "Whispering Pines Ranch, north of town. Charlotte Harlow. I know who you are. Town's not that big." His tone wasn't unfriendly, just matter of fact. "You're the educated one, Mrs. Montgomery's taken in." Charlotte felt a flicker of irritation. "I work for Mrs. Montgomery. There's a difference." Something like amusement crossed his weather-lined face. "Not from where most folks stand." He tipped his hat and led the horse away, leaving Charlotte to wonder why his assessment bothered her more than others had. The next day, while organizing donation records for the Ladies' Aid Society, Charlotte overheard Mrs. Montgomery and Widow Jenkins discussing her through the partially open office door. "She's certainly made herself useful," Mrs. Montgomery was saying, "though I worry about her prospects. Too much education makes a woman restless, unsuited for the practical matters of frontier life. Samuel Wilson showed good sense in sending her away." Widow Jenkins replied. Imagine such a woman trying to manage children and a store. She'd be correcting her husband's grammar while the accounts fell into disarray. Still, there's something to be admired in her determination. Perhaps with proper guidance, she might yet find a suitable position. The Peterson boy might consider her with his interest in books. At her age, she'd be fortunate to receive any offer. Educated or not, the bloom fades quickly out here. Charlotte's cheeks burned as she silently gathered her things and slipped out the back door. The cool air did little to soothe the sting of their words. She walked without direction, eventually finding herself at the edge of town near Thomas Reed's smithy. The rhythmic sound of hammer striking metal drew her forward. Thomas looked up from his work, his expression shifting from concentration to concern as he took in her face. "Heard something you shouldn't have?" he asked, setting aside his hammer. "Apparently I'm simultaneously overeducated and past my prime," Charlotte said with forced lightness. "Quite an achievement for 30 years of life." Thomas gestured to a bench beside his water barrel. "People talk doesn't make them right. But it does make them influential," Charlotte sighed, sinking onto the bench. "I came west because I believed it was a place where one could redefine oneself, where the constraints of Eastern society might loosen their grip." "It can be," Thomas agreed, returning to his work, but keeping his hammer strikes lighter to allow conversation. "But people bring their ideas with them, same as they bring their furniture and their fears." Charlotte found unexpected comfort in the smithy, watching Thomas shape metal with careful precision. His words carried the weight of someone who had grappled with Pine Ridge's limitations far longer than she had. "Samuel Wilson isn't the measure of your worth," Thomas said after a while, his focus seemingly on the horseshoe taking form beneath his hammer. "Neither is Eleanor Montgomery." "Then who is?" Charlotte hadn't meant to ask the question aloud. Thomas looked up, his expression serious. "No one but yourself. That's the truest freedom the West offers, though folks don't advertise it." As the afternoon light began to fade, Charlotte reluctantly prepared to leave. "Thank you for the sanctuary. Open to all wandering librarians," Thomas replied with the hint of a smile. "Anytime." The following morning, Charlotte arrived at the meeting house to find Mrs. Montgomery waiting with unusual tension in her normally composed features. "There you are," she said. "We've had word from the Whispering Pines Ranch. There's been an accident, one of the hands caught in a cattle stampede. They've requested any medical supplies we can spare and someone who can read instructions properly." Charlotte's thoughts immediately went to Emmett Burke and the brief encounter by the creek. "Is Mr. Burke—" "He's unharmed," Mrs. Montgomery said, misunderstanding Charlotte's concern. "But he was quite specific about needing someone with book learning to help with the doctoring manual. I thought perhaps—" "I'll go," Charlotte said without hesitation. "Just tell me what to bring." Within the hour, Charlotte found herself in a wagon driven by Thomas Reed, the back loaded with bandages, laudanum, and other supplies the town could spare. Thomas had volunteered when it became clear that the regular driver was unavailable. "You know the way to Whispering Pines?" Charlotte asked as they left town behind. Thomas nodded. "Been there many times. Burke's anvil needs tending same as any other." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the landscape opening around them in waves of spring green touched with wildflowers. After navigating a particularly rough stretch of road, Thomas spoke. "Burke's a good man, stubborn as oak, and about as yielding but fair. Ranch has been struggling since his wife died 3 years back." Charlotte absorbed this information. "He didn't seem the type to admit needing help easily." "He isn't," Thomas agreed. "Must be desperate to send for someone with book learning. His words, I'm guessing." "More or less." Charlotte smiled faintly. "I suppose I should be flattered that my education is finally considered useful." Thomas's expression remained thoughtful. "Useful isn't the same as valued. Be careful with that distinction. The ranch appeared as they crested a gentle rise, a collection of sturdy buildings nestled in a valley embraced by pine-covered hills. The main house stood with solid presence, its windows reflecting the midday sun. To one side stretched a bunkhouse, barn and corral where several horses moved restlessly. Emmett Burke emerged from the main house as they pulled up, his expression a complex mixture of relief and wariness. Exhaustion lined his face and blood stained his shirt sleeve. "Reed," he acknowledged with a nod before turning to Charlotte. "Miss Harlow, thank you for coming." "Where is he?" Charlotte asked, already gathering her skirts to dismount. "Bunkhouse. Peterson's with him now, but the bleeding won't stop, and none of us can make sense of the doctor's manual." The admission clearly cost him, but concern for his injured man outweighed pride. Charlotte followed Emmett to the bunkhouse, where a young man lay pale and sweating on a narrow cot. His leg was wrapped in blood-soaked bandages, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. An older ranch hand looked up with evident relief as they entered. "The bleeding slowed some, but he's burning up something fierce," the man reported. Charlotte moved to the injured cowboy's side, setting down the bag of medical supplies. "What's his name?" "Daniel," Emmett replied. "Daniel Moss, 19 years old. First season as a full hand." Charlotte gently touched the young man's forehead, finding it hot and dry. "I need clean water, as much light as possible, and fresh bandages." Her voice took on the quiet authority she had once used in her library, the tone that expected compliance. Without question, to her mild surprise, Emmett immediately began issuing orders to bring what she needed. Thomas stepped in as well, helping to position the bunkhouse table near the window where the light was strongest. Charlotte located the doctor's manual, a well-worn volume with cramped printing and detailed illustrations. "The wound needs cleaning before anything else," she said, after finding the relevant section. "Then we'll need to check for bone damage." What followed was 3 hours of intense focus. Charlotte read instructions aloud, demonstrating procedures when necessary, her hands becoming streaked with blood and antiseptic. Emmett worked alongside her without complaint, following her directions with the same concentration he might give to breaking a wild horse. By late afternoon, Daniel's wound had been properly cleaned, stitched and dressed. His fever had broken under cold compresses, and he had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Charlotte stepped outside the bunkhouse, her shoulders aching and her dress hopelessly stained. The coolness of approaching evening felt like a blessing against her heated skin. She was washing her hands in a basin of clean water when Emmett joined her. "He'll live," he said, not quite a question. "Yes," Charlotte agreed, "though he'll need careful tending for the next few days. Infection is still the greatest danger." Emmett's eyes held a wariness that seemed to be evaluating her anew. "You've done this before." "Tended wounds?" "Yes. My father was a medical librarian at Harvard. I grew up shelving anatomy texts and pharmaceutical guides. When doctors visited our home, I listened. Listening and doing aren't the same." "No," Charlotte agreed, "but they become closer when there's no alternative." Something shifted in Emmett's expression, not quite softening, but a fractional release of judgment. "You and Reed should stay the night. It'll be dark soon, and the road's treacherous enough in daylight." It wasn't an effusive invitation, but Charlotte recognized it as significant nonetheless. "Thank you. I'd like to check on Daniel again before morning." As Emmett walked away, Thomas appeared at Charlotte's side, a plate of food in his hands. "Cook sent this, said you hadn't eaten since breakfast." Charlotte accepted the plate gratefully, realizing suddenly how hungry she was. "I've been invited to stay the night. We both have." Thomas nodded. "Burke offered me the guest room. Said you could take his daughter's old room in the main house." "He has a daughter?" Charlotte hadn't considered Emmett Burke as a father. "Had," She married a banker from Denver 2 years ago, comes to visit at Christmas, but that's about all. They ate in companionable silence as twilight deepened around the ranch. The vast Wyoming sky transformed into a canvas of deep blues and purples, stars emerging with startling brightness. "It's beautiful here," Charlotte said softly. "I can see why people would choose this life, despite its hardships." Thomas's expression was contemplative. "Choice is a luxury. Even out here, most of us end up where circumstance delivers us. The beauty is in making peace with it." "Is that what you've done?" "Made peace?" He smiled slightly. "Most days. You?" Charlotte considered the question. "I'm working on it. Today helped, feeling useful again." After checking on Daniel once more, Charlotte was shown to a small but comfortable bedroom in the main house. The room had the feeling of a space preserved rather than abandoned. Books still lined a small shelf, and a faded quilt covered the bed with deliberate care. She slept deeply that night, waking only once when she thought she heard footsteps passing her door, Emmett checking on his household, she presumed. The thought brought an unexpected warmth that carried her back to sleep. Morning came with the sounds of a working ranch, men calling to each other, horses nickering, the rhythmic chopping of wood. Charlotte dressed quickly and went to check on Daniel, finding him awake and markedly improved. "Miss Harlow," he greeted her weakly. "Mr. Burke says you saved my leg. Maybe my life." "The doctor's manual did that," Charlotte replied, checking his bandages. "I just translated the complicated parts." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Been around enough to know the difference between reading words and knowing what they mean." "Thank you." Charlotte found herself unexpectedly touched by the simple gratitude. It was refreshing after months of being evaluated and found either excessive or inadequate. She was replacing Daniel's bandages when Emmett entered, carrying a tray of breakfast. He watched her work without comment, then said, "You handle that, like you've done it for years." "Just the practice from yesterday," Charlotte replied, securing the clean bandage. "The body remembers what the mind is taught." Emmett set down the tray and motioned for Charlotte to join him outside. In the morning light, the ranch spread before them in a panorama of purpose. Men moving between tasks with practiced efficiency, animals grazing in nearby pastures, the land itself rolling toward distant mountains. "I owe you a debt," Emmett said without preamble. "Daniel's a good hand, can't afford to lose him." "There's no debt," Charlotte assured him. "Anyone would have helped." "Not anyone," Emmett contradicted her. "Takes a particular kind of courage to step into blood and chaos without flinching." They stood in silence for a moment, the morning breeze carrying the scent of pine and promise. Finally, Emmett spoke again, his voice carrying an undercurrent of restraint. "Miss Harlow, forgive my directness, but I'm given to understand your situation in town is temporary." Charlotte tensed slightly. "Mrs. Montgomery's charity, you mean?" "I wouldn't presume to characterize it," Emmett replied carefully, "but it leads me to a proposition. I need someone to teach my ranch hands to read and figure better. Most can barely sign their names, and it's causing problems with contracts and supply orders." The offer caught Charlotte completely by surprise. "You want me to teach your men? 3 evenings a week. I can pay $2 per session, plus transportation to and from town." He spoke matter-of-factly, as though discussing a business transaction rather than potentially changing her circumstances. "Why me?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious. "Surely Mr. Peterson from the town school—" "Peterson has his hands full," Emmett interrupted. "And these men won't take to being treated like schoolboys. They need someone who understands that education serves purpose." The assessment was surprisingly perceptive. "You formed that opinion of me rather quickly, Mr. Burke." Something like amusement flickered across his features. "I've watched you with that doctor's manual. You don't worship books, you use them. That's the difference that matters out here." Charlotte considered the offer, recognizing it for what it was, not charity but opportunity. A chance to build. Something of her own, however modest. "I accept," she said simply. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow evening. I'll send a wagon at 4. Emmett extended his hand to seal the agreement, and Charlotte took it without hesitation, noting the calluses that spoke of years of physical labor. The ride back to Pine Ridge with Thomas passed in thoughtful conversation. Charlotte explained Emmett's proposition, and Thomas nodded with apparent approval. "Burke doesn't make offers lightly," he observed. "He sees value where others don't." "Or he's desperate," Charlotte countered, not wanting to assign too much significance to a practical arrangement. Thomas gave her a sideways glance. "Both can be true." Upon returning to town, Charlotte found herself immediately summoned to the Montgomery home. Eleanor Montgomery waited in her parlor, her posture rigid with barely concealed displeasure. "You spent the night at Whispering Pines," she stated without preamble. Unchaperoned, Charlotte maintained her composure. "Mr. Reed was there as well. The injured man needed continued care, and travel at night would have been dangerous." Nonetheless, appearances must be considered. Mrs. Montgomery's tone was that of someone explaining an obvious truth to a child. "Your reputation is already complicated. This doesn't help matters." Charlotte felt a surge of frustration. A man's life was at stake. Surely that outweighs gossip. "You're still thinking like an Easterner," Mrs. Montgomery said with a slight sigh. "Out here, a woman's reputation is her only real currency. Without it, she has nothing." "I have my education," Charlotte replied. "And now I have employment as well." Mrs. Montgomery's eyebrows rose slightly. "Employment?" "Mr. Burke has hired me to teach reading and mathematics to his ranch hands, 3 evenings per week." The older woman's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something between concern and calculation. "I see. And you accepted without consultation." "I wasn't aware I needed permission," Charlotte said carefully. "The arrangement with the library was for mornings only." "Of course," Mrs. Montgomery conceded with a tight smile. "But one wonders about Mr. Burke's motivations. A widower for 3 years, suddenly inviting a single woman to his ranch regularly." Charlotte felt her cheeks warm despite herself. "It's a business arrangement, nothing more. All arrangements begin as one thing before becoming another." Mrs. Montgomery rose, signaling the end of the conversation. "Just be careful, my dear. Emmett Burke has built his life in isolation for good reason. Not everyone is meant for civilization." The warning, for that was clearly what it was intended to be, lingered with Charlotte as she walked back to her rented room. Mrs. Montgomery's insinuations were both presumptuous and oddly disquieting, not because Charlotte feared Emmett Burke's intentions, but because she found herself curious about them in a way that surprised her. The next afternoon, Charlotte prepared for her first teaching session at Whispering Pines with the same care she had once given to university presentations. She selected reading materials of practical value, agricultural bulletins, basic contracts, supply inventories, and developed simple exercises to build confidence. The wagon arrived precisely at 4, driven not by a ranch hand as she had expected, but by Emmett himself. He offered a hand to help her up to the seat, his manner courteous but reserved. "The men are nervous," he told her as they headed out, "of town. Most have avoided schooling their whole lives." "Then we won't call it school," Charlotte replied. "We'll call it tools for the job." Emmett glanced at her with what might have been approval. "You understand more than I gave you credit for." "A common oversight," Charlotte said dryly. To her surprise, Emmett laughed, a short, genuine sound that transformed his weather-lined face. "I deserved that." The evening proved both challenging and rewarding. 8 men of varying ages gathered in the bunkhouse, their expressions ranging from outright suspicion to cautious interest. Charlotte began not with letters or numbers, but with a problem. "Mr. Burke tells me you lost nearly $50 last month due to a misread contract," she said without preamble. "That's money out of your pockets as much as his. I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again." The direct approach seemed to resonate. By the end of 2 hours, even the most resistant men had made some effort, particularly when Charlotte framed reading as a defense against being cheated rather than a scholarly pursuit. As she packed up her materials, Charlotte noticed Daniel. Watching from his cot, his color much improved. "You got Jackson to sound out words," he said, clearly impressed. "Man's avoided letters like they're rattlesnakes his whole life." "Everyone wants to read when the words matter to them," Charlotte replied. "It's finding what matters. That's the trick." Outside, Emmett waited by the wagon. "How did they do?" "Better than they think," Charlotte said honestly. "A few weeks of consistent practice will make a significant difference." Emmett helped her into the wagon with careful hands. "The men respect you. That's not easily earned." "Respect comes from being seen," Charlotte observed, as they began the journey back to town. "Most people look at ranch hands and see only their function. Same with women like me, too educated to fit neatly into categories." Emmett was quiet for several moments, guiding the horses through a rocky section of road before responding. "My late wife used to say something similar. Catherine was a schoolteacher before we married. People thought she was wasting her learning. On a ranch, was she?" Charlotte asked softly. "No," Emmett replied, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "She brought books and ideas to a place that needed both. Started a small school for the neighboring children. When she died, that part of Whispering Pines died with her." The admission felt significant. A piece of himself offered without calculation. Charlotte received it with the respect it deserved. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply. 3 years is a long time," Emmett replied, his tone suggesting he was speaking more to himself than to her. "Too long to keep living in the aftermath." They completed the journey in companionable silence, the evening air growing cooler as stars appeared overhead. At the edge of town, Charlotte expected Emmett to let her walk the remaining distance to her lodgings, mindful of appearances. Instead, he drove directly to Mrs. Patton's boarding house, drawing curious glances from passers-by. "Thank you for today," he said as he helped her down from the wagon. "For all of it, Daniel, the teaching, everything." "You're giving me a chance to use my abilities," Charlotte replied. "The gratitude is mutual." Emmett held her gaze for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Friday then, same time." "Friday," Charlotte confirmed, aware of a window curtain twitching in a neighboring house, the engines of gossip already at work. As Emmett drove away, Charlotte climbed the stairs to her room, her mind unexpectedly full. She had come west seeking a fresh start, only to find herself trapped in new constraints. Yet today had offered a glimpse of something different, a place where her education might be valued, not despite the frontier setting, but because of it. She fell asleep that night, with the scent of pine still clinging to her hair, and the memory of Emmett Burke's rare laugh warming her thoughts. The teaching arrangement quickly became the cornerstone of Charlotte's new life in Pine Ridge. 3 evenings each week, Emmett Burke's wagon would appear outside Mrs. Patton's boarding house, prompting curious glances from neighbors that Charlotte steadfastly ignored. The journey to Whispering Pines offered a welcome escape from the town's watchful eyes, the landscape opening around them like a book whose pages revealed new details with each reading. By the 3rd week, Charlotte had established a routine with the ranch hands. Their initial wariness had given way to grudging respect, then to genuine engagement as they discovered the practical advantages of literacy. Jackson, the oldest among them, had proudly signed his name on the monthly supply order instead of marking an X. Young Collins had written his first letter home to his mother in Texas. Even gruff Peterson, who maintained that book learning was, for folks with soft hands, had been caught reading a newspaper during his evening watch. "You've changed things," Emmett observed one evening as he drove Charlotte back to town. The May sunset stretched long shadows across the rolling hills, painting the world in amber and gold. The men talk differently, think differently. Education does that, Charlotte replied. It doesn't just add knowledge, it creates new possibilities for seeing the world. Emmett guided the horses around a bend in the road before responding. "My father would have called that dangerous thinking." "Was he wrong?" "No," Emmett admitted with the ghost of a smile, "but neither are you." These moments, honest exchanges unclouded by social pretense, had become precious to Charlotte. In town, her position remained precarious, balanced between Mrs. Montgomery's diminishing patronage and the growing whispers about her regular visits to Whispering Pines. Only Thomas Reed and Sarah Miller offered friendship without judgment, though even they sometimes exchanged concerned glances when Charlotte mentioned Emmett. The town's annual Founders' Day celebration arrived with the first real warmth of June. Pine Ridge transformed itself with bunting and banners. The meeting house square became a venue for displays of local crafts and produce, and a dance was planned for the evening. Charlotte helped organize the modest library exhibit, arranging books and reading materials with the care she had once given to rare manuscripts in Boston. "You've done wonders with our little collection," Mrs. Montgomery observed, surveying the display. Her tone carried approval, but her eyes held calculation. Sheriff Winters was just remarking how organized everything has become. Charlotte recognized the comment for what it was, a gentle reminder that other options existed besides her arrangement with Emmett Burke. Sheriff Winters was a widower of suitable age and position, exactly the kind of match Mrs. Montgomery would consider appropriate. "The library has been a joy to organize," Charlotte replied neutrally, "though I admit my teaching at Whispering Pines has become equally rewarding." Mrs. Montgomery adjusted her shawl with deliberate precision. "Yes, quite. An unusual situation. 3 nights weekly at a bachelor's ranch. People do talk, my dear. People often talk about what they don't understand," Charlotte said evenly. "I teach 8 grown men to read in a bunkhouse with the door open. Hardly the stuff of scandal. Intent and appearance are different matters, particularly when Emmett Burke is involved." Mrs. Montgomery lowered her voice. "His history with Catherine was complicated. She came as a mail-order bride, you know, very educated, like yourself. Their match was considered unusual." Charlotte hadn't known this detail about Emmett's late wife, and the parallel to her own situation was not lost on her. They seemed to have built a good life together. Until her death, yes. Mrs. Montgomery's expression softened slightly. Catherine was well respected, despite her unconventional beginnings. She knew how to adapt to frontier life. "I had hoped you might find a similar path, though perhaps with someone more integrated into town society." The implication hung in the air between them, a warning wrapped in friendly concern. Before Charlotte could respond, Thomas Reed approached, his usual work clothes replaced by a clean shirt and waistcoat for the celebration. "Miss Harlow," he greeted her with a warm smile, "your book display has everyone talking. Mrs. Miller says her boy hasn't stopped asking for stories since you started reading to the children." Mrs. Montgomery excused herself with pointed politeness, leaving Charlotte grateful for Thomas's timely arrival. "Thank you for the rescue," she said quietly, as they moved away from the display. "Looked like you needed a diversion," Thomas replied. "Mrs. Montgomery's advice comes with expectations attached." "So I'm learning." Charlotte glanced around the festive square, taking in the sight of the town gathered in celebration. Children chased each other between display tables. Women compared needlework and preserves. Men gathered in clusters discussing cattle prices and weather predictions. It was a community bound by shared experience and understanding, one she still observed from its edges. "Will you attend the dance tonight?" Thomas asked, interrupting her thoughts. "I hadn't planned to," Charlotte admitted. "Dancing isn't my particular talent." "Nor mine," Thomas said with a self-deprecating smile. "But I thought perhaps you might allow me to demonstrate my lack of skill regardless, as friends." The offer touched Charlotte unexpectedly. Thomas had become a steadfast ally in Pine Ridge, his quiet support unwavering. "As friends," she agreed. "Though I warn you, my last dance partner claimed I counted steps under my breath." "Did you?" "Of course," Charlotte laughed. "How else would one maintain proper rhythm?" Their shared laughter drew curious glances from nearby townspeople, and Charlotte realized how rarely she had allowed herself such moments of unguarded joy since arriving in Pine Ridge. Perhaps tonight's dance offered an opportunity to be seen as more than just the overeducated Eastern woman or the object of Mrs. Montgomery's charity project. As the day's festivities wound toward evening, Charlotte returned to her room to change for the dance. She had brought only one suitable dress from Boston, a deep blue silk with modest lace trim, more restrained than fashionable, but the best. She arranged her hair simply but with care, conscious that tonight would further shape how Pine Ridge perceived her. The meeting house had been transformed for the dance, its usual rows of benches pushed aside to create an open floor. Lanterns hung from the ceiling beams, casting a warm glow over proceedings. A small group of local musicians tuned instruments in the corner, while townspeople filtered in, dressed in their finest clothes. Thomas waited by the entrance, his tall frame easy to spot among the gathering crowd. He offered his arm, with formal courtesy that carried a hint of humor. "Ready to count some steps, Miss Harlow?" "I've been practicing in my head all afternoon," Charlotte replied, accepting his arm. They had just joined the growing assembly when a murmur passed through the crowd. Charlotte turned to see Emmett Burke entering the meeting house. He wore a dark suit that transformed his usual rugged appearance, though nothing could quite tame the weathered quality of his features or the watchful alertness in his eyes. Those eyes found Charlotte immediately, and he made his way toward her with determined strides. "Miss Harlow," he greeted her formally. "Read." He nodded to Thomas with the brief acknowledgement of men who understood each other's place in the order of things. "Burke," Thomas returned evenly. "Didn't expect to see you at a town dance." "Thought it was time to rejoin civilization," Emmett replied, his gaze returning to Charlotte. "Miss Harlow, I was hoping you might save a dance for me this evening." The request caught Charlotte off guard. In all their interactions at Whispering Pines, Emmett had maintained a careful distance, their relationship defined by mutual respect and the shared purpose of educating his men. This public gesture suggested something different, something that would be observed and interpreted by everyone in Pine Ridge. "Of course," she heard herself agreeing, "I'd be happy to." The music began, and Thomas led Charlotte onto the floor for the first dance. He moved with surprising grace for a man who spent his days at an anvil, guiding her through the patterns with gentle confidence. "Burke doesn't attend town functions," Thomas observed quietly as they turned. "Not since Catherine died. His being here tonight will start talk." "Everything starts talk in Pine Ridge," Charlotte replied, though she understood his meaning. "Is there something I should know about Emmett's history here?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Catherine's death hit him hard. Fever took her quickly. Some thought he blamed the town doctor for not saving her, though he never said as much. He just withdrew, focused on the ranch, stopped coming to town except for supplies. And people allowed him that space? Out here, a man's grief is His own business, Thomas said simply, but re-emergence is noted just as carefully as retreat. The dance ended, and another began. Charlotte found herself partnered with Sheriff Winters, then Mr. Abernathy from the Mercantile, both men making careful conversation that never quite disguised their assessment of her. Through it all, she remained aware of Emmett's presence at the edge of the room, his attention following her movements. When he finally approached for their promised dance, a momentary hush fell over the nearby conversations. Emmett either didn't notice or chose to ignore it, extending his hand to Charlotte. With formal courtesy, "I should warn you," Charlotte said as they took their positions for a waltz. "I'm told I count steps aloud." "I won't mind," Emmett replied, his hand settling at her waist with careful respect. "Numbers make more sense than most conversation. Anyway." The music began, and Charlotte discovered that Emmett danced with the same sure competence he brought to everything, neither showy nor hesitant, but grounded in purpose. His hand at her waist was steady, his steps precise without being rigid. "You dance well for a man who avoids social gatherings," she observed. "Catherine insisted I learn," he replied, a flicker of remembered fondness crossing his features. "Said a man should know how to move through the world with some grace, even if he preferred the company of cattle." The mention of his late wife surprised Charlotte. Emmett rarely spoke of Catherine, though her presence lingered in the carefully preserved room at Whispering Pines and in the books that still lined shelves in the main house. "She sounds like she knew her own mind," Charlotte said carefully. "She did," Emmett agreed. Coming west as a mail-order bride took courage. Finding herself rejected for being too educated for a frontier wife took even more. Charlotte nearly missed a step. Catherine was rejected? By the man who sent for her? Yes, a rancher over in Split Rock. Emmett guided her through a turn, his hand firm at her waist. "I was in town delivering cattle when she arrived. She was sitting on the station platform with nowhere to go, a trunk full of books, and enough dignity not to cry about it." The parallel to Charlotte's own arrival in Aspen Grove was so striking that she fell silent, processing the revelation. Emmett seemed to understand her thoughts without requiring words. "Sometimes history doesn't repeat," he said quietly. "Sometimes it just offers a second chance to get things right." Before Charlotte could respond, the music ended. Emmett released her with proper decorum, but his eyes held hers a moment longer than convention dictated. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Harlow." He stepped away, leaving Charlotte aware of curious glances from all directions. Mrs. Montgomery stood by the refreshment table, her expression a study in concerned disapproval. Thomas watched from across the room, his face unreadable, and somewhere between these poles of judgment and support, Charlotte realized she needed to find her own position. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and careful navigation of social expectations. Charlotte danced twice more, once with Thomas again, and once with young Mr. Peterson from the school. Emmett departed shortly after their dance, nodding farewell to her from across the room before slipping out into the night. As the celebration wound down, Charlotte found herself on the meeting house porch, seeking a moment of cool air and solitude. The stars spread above Pine Ridge in brilliant clarity, the kind of sky she had never seen in Boston, with its coal smoke and close-packed buildings. "Quite a night," Thomas's voice came from the shadows. He stepped forward to join her at the railing, offering his handkerchief. "You look like you could use this." Charlotte realized she had been pressing her fingers to her temples. "Thank you. Just a small headache from the noise and heat." "And the scrutiny," Thomas added perceptively. "Burke's appearance caused quite a stir." "So I gathered," Charlotte sighed, "though I fail to see why a widower attending a town dance should provoke such interest. It's not the attending, it's the why." Thomas leaned against the railing, his posture relaxed but his eyes serious. People see what they expect to see. Right now, they see a man emerging from grief with purpose. And that purpose is assumed to be me, Charlotte concluded, despite the complete lack of evidence. Thomas studied her face in the lantern light. Is there a complete lack of evidence? The question caught Charlotte unprepared. She had been so focused on defending her professional relationship with Emmett that she hadn't fully examined her own emerging feelings. The revelation about Catherine, another educated woman rejected as unsuitable, whom Emmett had valued enough to marry, had shifted something in her understanding. I don't know, she admitted honestly. Everything has happened so quickly since I arrived. Sometimes I feel I'm still catching up to my own life. No rush to decide, Thomas said with gentle understanding. Just be clear-eyed about the choice. Burke is a good man, but Whispering Pines is a demanding mistress. It's a hard life, especially for someone used to libraries and lectures. You sound like Mrs. Montgomery, Charlotte observed, though without rancor. God forbid, Thomas laughed, softly. But even a stopped clock is right twice a day. The concern is legitimate, even if the motivation differs. Charlotte considered his words. And what is your motivation, Thomas? Friendship, he replied without hesitation. The real kind that wants what's best for you, not what's most convenient for Pine Ridge's social order. The honesty of his answer warmed her. I value that more than I can say. They stood in companionable silence for a few moments before Thomas spoke again. Whatever you decide, remember you have options. You've built something here, connections that matter. That's no small achievement for 6 weeks in a strange place. As Charlotte prepared for bed that night, she found herself reviewing the evening's events with new perspective. Emmett's presence at the dance represented a deliberate choice, a public statement of some kind, though its exact meaning remained unclear. His revelation about Catherine suggested a deeper connection between their situations than she had realized. And yet, Thomas's warning lingered. Whispering Pines demanded a particular kind of commitment, a willingness to embrace isolation and hardship that went beyond teaching ranch hands to read. Was she prepared for such a life, or was she simply responding to the first person who had seen value in her education rather than inconvenience? Sleep came slowly, her thoughts circling between possibility and caution. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of dancing not in the meeting house, but under open sky, with no watching eyes to judge the rightness of her steps. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Charlotte's door. Sarah Miller arrived early, her face flushed with either exertion or excitement. Charlotte, you must come quickly, she said without preamble. There's been an accident at the schoolhouse. Mr. Peterson fell from the roof while making repairs. His arm is broken, and the town council is meeting to discuss what to do about the remaining school term. Charlotte dressed hurriedly and followed Sarah to the meeting house, where an impromptu gathering of Pine Ridge's leading citizens was already underway. Mrs. Montgomery presided with practiced authority, Sheriff Winters and Mr. Abernathy flanking her like sentries. "Ah, Miss Harlow," Mrs. Montgomery greeted her with pointed satisfaction. "How fortunate you've joined us. We were just discussing the predicament of our school children, with 3 weeks remaining in the term and no teacher to guide them." I say, calculated nature of the situation was immediately apparent to Charlotte. This was not merely a crisis response, but an opportunity being presented, a chance to redirect her path away from Whispering Pines and back toward town-approved respectability. "Mr. Peterson's injury is most unfortunate," Charlotte replied carefully. "I hope his recovery will be swift. The doctor expects 6 weeks at minimum before he can return to duties," Sheriff Winters informed her. "The children cannot be left without instruction for so long." Mrs. Montgomery smiled with benevolent purpose. Which is why we thought of you, my dear. Your qualifications are certainly superior to our modest needs. The town council is prepared to offer you the position, temporarily, of course, until Mr. Peterson recovers. Or perhaps longer, Mr. Abernathy added with meaningful emphasis, should the arrangement prove satisfactory to all parties. The offer hung in the air, not just employment, but legitimacy, a path to acceptance that conveniently eliminated her evenings at Whispering Pines. Charlotte felt the weight of expectation from every face in the room, the silent assumption that she would gratefully accept the opportunity to step into respectability. "I'm honored by your confidence," she began carefully, "but I should note that I have an existing commitment to Mr. Burke and the educational program at Whispering Pines." Mrs. Montgomery waved this aside. "I'm certain Emmett will understand that the needs of 20 children must take precedence over a few ranch hands learning their letters. The school position would require your full attention, including preparation time in the evenings." The deliberate nature of this stipulation was unmistakable. Charlotte felt a flash of frustration at the manipulation, however well-intentioned it might be in some minds. "May I have until tomorrow to consider?" she asked, buying time to think through her options. "Of course," Mrs. Montgomery agreed with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already determined. "Though I should mention that several parents have already expressed enthusiasm about having someone of your educational background teaching their children. It would be a shame to disappoint them." Charlotte left the meeting house with Sarah Miller at her side, both women walking in thoughtful silence until they were beyond earshot of the town council members. "They've been planning this since Peterson mentioned fixing the schoolhouse roof yesterday," Sarah said quietly. "It's not about the children, it's about keeping you in town where they can see you and away from Whispering Pines," Charlotte added, unable to keep a note of bitterness from her voice. "Heaven forbid a woman of education find purpose outside their approved boundaries." They paused at the corner where their paths would diverge. Sarah toward her home, Charlotte toward her rented room. The morning sun illuminated Pine Ridge's main street, where business continued as usual, unaware of the subtle power struggle unfolding in their midst. "What will you do?" Sarah asked. Charlotte gazed toward the distant hills, where Whispering Pines Ranch lay beyond sight, but never far from her thoughts. "I don't know yet. The teaching position makes practical sense. It would provide steadier income, more security. But," Sarah prompted gently, "but it feels like surrendering to their judgment rather than making my own choice," Charlotte admitted. "The work at Whispering Pines matters. Those men are learning skills that change their lives in tangible ways." Sarah squeezed her arm in silent support. "Whatever you decide, Matthew and I remain your friends. Some of us remember what it's like to face Pine Ridge's expectations." The reminder that Sarah had once navigated her own challenging path in town, arriving as a young widow with a small child, offered Charlotte unexpected comfort. Perhaps there were more allies in Pine Ridge than she realized, people who had carved their own way despite convention. Charlotte spent the remainder of the morning in restless contemplation, alternately pacing her small room and sitting motionless at her window. The school position offered a clear path to acceptance in Pine Ridge, respectable work aligned with her training, the chance to build a secure future in town. Yet, something in her resisted, pushing back against the neat solution being presented. By mid-afternoon, she had made no progress in resolving her dilemma. The walls of her rented room seemed to close in around her, and she decided that fresh air might clear her thoughts. She found herself walking toward Thomas Reed's smithy, drawn by the promise of honest conversation without judgment. The rhythmic sound of hammer on metal guided her to the open-sided workshop where Thomas shaped iron with practiced precision. He looked up as she approached, setting aside his work without comment or question, as if he had been expecting her visit. "Town council offered me the school position," Charlotte said without preamble. Thomas wiped his hands on a cloth and gestured toward the bench that had become their customary spot for conversation. Peterson's accident creates a convenient opportunity. Too convenient to be entirely coincidental, Charlotte agreed, sinking onto the bench. Mrs. Montgomery all but stated I would need to end my arrangement with Whispering Pines to take the position. "And what do you want to do?" Thomas asked. His directness refreshing after the council's circuitous manipulations. Charlotte sighed. "That's the question, isn't it? The practical choice is clear. The school position offers stability, respectability, a place in the community. It aligns with my training and abilities." "But," Thomas prompted, echoing Sarah's earlier question, "but it feels like accepting their vision of where I belong rather than discovering it for myself," Charlotte replied. "And there's Whispering Pines to consider, the progress the men are making, the commitment I've made to them and to Emmett." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Have you considered that both choices might be limiting in their own way? The school puts you in a box of Pine Ridge's making. Whispering Pines," he hesitated, "puts me in Emmett Burke's box," Charlotte finished, a note of challenge in her voice. "Not exactly," Thomas clarified, "but any choice that ties your future entirely to someone else's vision carries risk, even when that someone values parts of you that others dismiss." The observation struck Charlotte with unexpected force. She had been so focused on the town's attempt to control her path that she hadn't fully considered whether Whispering Pines represented true independence or simply a different kind of dependence. "What would you do?" she asked finally. Thomas smiled slightly. "I'd probably make horseshoes and mind my own business, same as always." "Thomas," Charlotte chided, though she couldn't help returning his smile. "The truth is, I don't know," he admitted more seriously. "But I think the answer might lie in what you came west for in the first place. Was it just escape from Boston, or were you seeking something specific?" The question resonated. Charlotte had left Boston following the collapse of her library position and engagement, seeking not just distance from humiliation, but a place where she might rebuild on her own terms. The mail-order arrangement had been a practical solution to financial necessity, not an end in itself. "I came to find independence," she said slowly, "to discover what I could build with my own hands and mind, without restriction." Thomas nodded. "Then perhaps the real question isn't town versus ranch, but which option offers you the freedom to keep building beyond their boundaries." Charlotte left the smithy with Thomas's words echoing in her thoughts. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward evening, she made her way to the small creek that wound past the edge of town. The sound of flowing water had always helped her think, even back in Boston when she would walk along the Charles River during difficult times. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't immediately notice the approaching rider. Emmett. Burke's voice startled her from contemplation. "Miss Harlow." Charlotte turned to find him dismounting from his horse, his expression concerned. "Mr. Burke, I wasn't expecting you in town today." "One of the hands mentioned seeing you walking alone toward the creek," Emmett explained, securing his horse. "To a nearby branch. Thought I'd make sure everything was all right." The gesture touched her, though she wondered which of the ranch hands had been watching her movements so carefully. "I'm fine, just thinking." Emmett approached, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough for conversation. "About the school position, I'd guess. News travels fast." "Of course it does," Charlotte said with resigned acceptance. "Did your informant also mention that accepting would require me to end our arrangement at Whispering Pines?" "He did," Emmett acknowledged, "though I'd have assumed as much regardless. Mrs. Montgomery has made her opinions on your evening teaching quite clear." Charlotte studied his face, trying to discern his thoughts on the matter. As always, Emmett maintained a careful reserve, though she had learned to read subtle shifts in his expression, the slight tension around his eyes that suggested concern, the faint line between his brows that appeared when he was troubled. "What do you think I should do?" she asked directly. "It's not my place to direct your choices," Emmett replied, though something flickered in his eyes that suggested he had more to say. "I'm not asking for direction," Charlotte clarified. "I'm asking for your honest thoughts as someone who would be affected by my decision." Emmett was silent for a moment, gazing past her toward the flowing creek. When he finally spoke, his voice carried careful deliberation. "The school needs a teacher. Those children deserve someone with your abilities and knowledge." In practical terms, it's the sensible choice. Charlotte felt a surprising wave of disappointment at his reasonable assessment. "And Whispering Pines?" "We'd manage," Emmett said simply. "The men have already learned more than I expected. We could continue with basic lessons even without your guidance." His pragmatic response stung more than it should have. Charlotte had known Emmett Burke to be a practical man, one who faced reality without sentiment or excessive attachment. She shouldn't have expected him to fight for her continued presence at the ranch, yet some small part of her had hoped for more than calm acceptance. "I see," she said, working to keep her voice even. "Well, that certainly simplifies matters." Emmett stepped closer, his expression shifting subtly. "That's what makes sense," he said carefully. "It's not what I want." The distinction caught Charlotte by surprise. "What do you want, Mr. Burke?" "I want you to continue teaching at Whispering Pines," he said, his usual reserve giving way to something more direct. "Not just for the men's sake, but because in 6 weeks you've brought something back to the ranch that I thought was lost forever. Purpose, learning, the belief that isolation doesn't have to mean ignorance." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts before continuing. "But more than that, I want you to make this choice based on what you want, not what Pine Ridge expects or what I need." Catherine came west because she believed she could build something that mattered. She stayed because she found that purpose at Whispering Pines, not because it was expected or convenient. The parallel to her own situation was unmistakable. "Mrs. Montgomery told me about Catherine last night," Charlotte said, "that she was rejected as a mail-order bride for being too educated like me." "Yes," Emmett acknowledged. "The similarity didn't escape me when you first arrived in Pine Ridge, but your path doesn't have to mirror hers. You're not Catherine, and I wouldn't want you to be." The honest acknowledgement touched Charlotte deeply. So many in Pine Ridge saw her as a role to fill: Mrs. Montgomery's charity project, Sheriff Winter's potential wife, the school teacher replacing Peterson. Even Thomas, for all his wisdom, sometimes seemed to see her as someone to protect from difficult choices. Emmett alone seemed to see her as an individual with her own distinct purpose. "Thank you for that," she said softly. "For seeing me as myself, not as someone else's expectation." Emmett's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "It's how Catherine taught me to see people, as they are, not as what you might want them to be." They stood in silence for a moment, the creek's gentle murmur filling the space between them. Charlotte realized they had reached a crossroads, not just in her decision about the teaching position, but in whatever undefined connection had been growing between them over these weeks. "I need to think," she said finally. "There's more at stake here than just where I teach." Emmett nodded, respecting her need for space. "I'll be at the Mercantile for another hour before heading back to the ranch. If you decide to continue at Whispering Pines, the wagon will be ready at the usual time tomorrow. If not—" He hesitated, then continued with careful neutrality. "I wish you well with the school position." He mounted his horse with the fluid ease of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, tipping his hat to her in farewell before riding back toward town. Charlotte watched him go, feeling the weight of decision pressing upon her with new urgency. As twilight deepened toward evening, Charlotte returned to Mrs. Patton's boarding house to find a note had been delivered in her absence. The neat handwriting belonged to Mrs. Montgomery, requesting Charlotte's presence for breakfast the following morning to discuss the school position details. The presumption that she had already accepted the offer sparked a flare of irritation that surprised her with its intensity. She slept fitfully that night, her dreams a confused mixture of classrooms and open rangeland, of Boston libraries and Whispering Pines bunkhouses. She woke before dawn, her mind no clearer but her spirit somehow steadier. As first light touched the eastern horizon, Charlotte dressed and made her way through the quiet streets to the place where her path in Pine Ridge had begun, the small library room in the meeting house. The door was unlocked, as it always was, in a town where theft remained a foreign concept. Charlotte lit a single lamp and moved through the familiar space, trailing her fingers along book spines she had carefully organized. The collection remained modest, but in the weeks since her arrival, it had grown with donated volumes and requested materials. She had built something here, something that would remain regardless of her decision. The realization crystallized something in her thoughts. Whatever path she chose, her efforts would leave a mark. The question was not which position to accept, but which mark she wished to make. One circumscribed by Pine Ridge's expectations, or one that might extend beyond boundaries into something new. When Mrs. Montgomery arrived for their scheduled breakfast meeting, she found not Charlotte, but a carefully written letter explaining that while Charlotte was honored by the school position offer, she had decided to pursue a different path. The letter outlined a proposal. Charlotte would continue her work at Whispering Pines 3 evenings a week, but would also establish formal Saturday classes for any Pine Ridge children or adults who wished to receive additional education beyond the standard curriculum. The arrangement would allow her to fulfill both commitments without compromise, while expanding educational opportunities for the entire community. It was not the answer Mrs. Montgomery had wanted, but it was presented with such clear logic and community benefit that outright rejection would be difficult to justify. Charlotte had effectively created a third option beyond the binary choice that had been presented to her. Not town or ranch, but a bridge between the two. By mid-morning, Charlotte had delivered similar letters to Sheriff Winters and Mr. Abernathy, the key decision-makers on the town council. She then made her way to Thomas Reed's smithy to share her decision. A compromise, Thomas observed after she explained her plan, though not the kind they expected. Not a compromise, Charlotte corrected gently. An expansion. Neither option alone felt complete. This way, I can build something larger than either Pine Ridge or Whispering Pines might have imagined. Thomas studied her with thoughtful assessment. It won't be easy. You'll face resistance from both sides. The town council won't like you maintaining independence, and Burke might not appreciate sharing your attention. Perhaps, Charlotte acknowledged. But if either truly values education and progress, they'll recognize the benefits outweigh the inconvenience. And if they don't, Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. Charlotte straightened her shoulders. Then I'll have learned something valuable about their true priorities, and I'll proceed accordingly. Thomas smiled, with genuine warmth. Catherine would have liked you, I think. The comparison no longer felt like a shadow to escape, but a connection to honor. I hope so. From everything I've heard, she was a remarkable woman. She was, Thomas agreed, but so are you in your own distinct way. By early afternoon, Charlotte had received no formal response from the town council, though she had noticed Mrs. Montgomery in deep conversation with several influential townspeople outside the meeting house. The lack of immediate rejection she took as a positive sign, or at least acknowledgement that her proposal merited consideration. She gathered her teaching materials and waited at the appointed time outside Mrs. Patton's boarding house, uncertain whether Emmett would appear with the wagon as usual. Part of her plan's success depended on his willingness to accept the modified arrangement, something she had proposed without consultation. The familiar sound of wagon wheels brought both relief and nervous anticipation. Emmett himself drove, his expression revealing nothing as he brought the wagon to a stop before her. "You're here," Charlotte said, immediately regretting the obvious statement. "You're waiting," Emmett replied, the faintest hint of humor lighting his eyes. "With your teaching materials, I notice." Charlotte took a deep breath. "I've made a decision about the school position. Or rather, I've proposed an alternative that I hope might satisfy everyone involved." She explained her plan for splitting her time between Whispering Pines and additional weekend education in town. Emmett listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful but unrevealing. "It's an ambitious undertaking," he said when she finished. "Teaching 6 days a week, divided between town and ranch. You'll exhaust yourself." "Perhaps initially," Charlotte acknowledged, "but I believe it's sustainable and necessary if I'm to build something that truly reflects my abilities and purpose." Emmett considered this, then asked the question that revealed his true concern. "And this is what you want? Not what you think will please the town or the ranch, but what you yourself choose?" "Yes," Charlotte said with quiet certainty. "This is my choice, made freely, with clear eyes." Something in Emmett's expression eased, the tension around his eyes softening. "Then Whispering Pines will adjust to the new schedule. The men will be pleased you're continuing their lessons even with the changes. And you?" Charlotte asked, needing to understand his personal response beyond the practical accommodation. Emmett's gaze held hers steadily. "I admire your solution. It shows the same independent thinking that's made you valuable at the ranch." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "And I'm glad you're not leaving Whispering Pines entirely." It wasn't an effusive declaration, but Charlotte had come to understand that Emmett Burke expressed himself in measured words and meaningful actions. His presence with the wagon, his acceptance of her plan, spoke volumes beyond what verbal eloquence might have conveyed. As they traveled toward Whispering Pines in the late afternoon light, a comfortable silence settled between them. The familiar landscape unfolded around them, rolling hills giving way to pine-covered slopes, the distant mountains standing sentinel against the sky. Charlotte realized that in just 6 weeks, this journey had become as familiar to her as the walk to Harvard's library had once been, the ranch as much a place of purpose as any classroom or reading room in Boston. "The men have a surprise for you," Emmett said as they approached the ranch entrance. "They've been working on it between chores." Charlotte looked at him curiously. "A surprise?" "You'll see," was all he would say, a rare smile briefly crossing his features. As they pulled into the ranch yard, Charlotte noticed unusual activity around the old storage shed that stood near the bunkhouse. It had been a dilapidated structure when she first began teaching at Whispering Pines, used mainly for broken equipment and supplies awaiting repair. Now, the shed had been transformed. Its weathered exterior had been repaired and painted, a new door hung squarely on sturdy hinges, and windows that had been boarded over now gleamed with clean glass. A small sign above the door read simply, "Whispering Pines School." Charlotte stared in amazement as several ranch hands emerged from the building, looking both proud and slightly embarrassed by her reaction. Jackson, the oldest among them, stepped forward. "Figured if we're to keep learning proper, you ought to have a proper place to teach," he said gruffly. "Not just the corner of a dusty bunkhouse." "We all pitched in," young Collins added eagerly. "Even Peterson helped with the roof, though he complained the whole time." Charlotte found herself momentarily speechless, touched beyond measure by the unexpected gesture. These men, many of whom had initially resisted her teaching, had created a space dedicated to learning, claiming education as a valued part of ranch life rather than an imposed requirement. "It's wonderful," she managed finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say except thank you." "Ain't fancy like a Boston library," Jackson acknowledged, "but it'll keep the rain off the books at least." Emmett stood slightly apart, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. When Charlotte caught his eye, he gave a small nod that confirmed what she had suspected. He had known about the project, but had allowed the men to claim it fully as their own gift. The interior was simple but thoughtfully arranged. A teacher's desk at the front, bench seating that could accommodate all the ranch hands, a slate board mounted on the wall, and most surprisingly, several shelves already stocked with books. "Where did these come from?" Charlotte asked, examining the small collection of agricultural guides, mathematics primers, and even a few volumes of history and literature. "Been gathering them a while," Emmett said, joining her at the shelves. "Catherine started collecting books for the ranch years ago. These were in storage since—" He paused, then continued more softly. "Since she passed. Seemed right they should be used again." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on Charlotte. These books represented not just practical resources, but a connection to the ranch's past, to Catherine's vision, and Emmett's willingness to see that vision continued through new hands. As summer settled over Pine Ridge and Whispering Pines Ranch, Charlotte's ambitious educational plan took shape with surprising momentum. The Saturday classes in town began modestly, just 7 children and 3 adults gathering in the meeting house library for additional instruction beyond the basic curriculum. But word spread quickly of Charlotte's engaging teaching methods and willingness to adapt lessons to individual needs. By the 3rd week, attendance had nearly doubled. The town council had ultimately accepted her proposal with reluctant pragmatism. Mrs. Montgomery maintained a careful cordiality that never quite disguised her disappointment at Charlotte's independence, while Sheriff Winters seemed genuinely impressed by her determination to serve both communities. Mr. Peterson, his arm healing slowly in a cast, observed one of her Saturday sessions and grudgingly admitted that her approach to mathematics instruction was unconventional but effective. At Whispering Pines, the newly established schoolroom became a source of unexpected pride among the ranch hands. Men who had once viewed reading as a necessary chore now lingered after lessons, borrowing books from the small but growing collection. Young Collins had progressed to writing regular letters home, while gruff Peterson had discovered an unlikely affinity for history, particularly accounts of the Civil War in which he had briefly served. Most surprising was Jackson, whose initial resistance had transformed into dedicated commitment. Charlotte discovered that behind his weathered exterior and limited formal education lay a natural mathematical mind. Once given proper instruction in calculations, Jackson took over much of the ranch's inventory management, freeing Emmett to focus on other pressing concerns. The ranch itself faced significant challenges that summer. An unusually dry season had left grazing land parched and water sources diminished. Cattle prices had dropped following overproduction throughout the territory, and a contract with a Denver meat supplier had fallen through unexpectedly. Charlotte became aware of these difficulties gradually through overheard conversations and the increasing tension in Emmett's manner. "You look tired," she observed one evening as they drove back toward town after lessons. The setting sun cast long shadows across the trail, painting the landscape in burnished gold that belied the dryness beneath. Emmett's hands remained steady on the reins, but the lines around his eyes had deepened. "Trying times for ranching," he replied with characteristic understatement. "Nothing that hasn't happened before." "Is there anything I can do to help?" Charlotte asked. "Perhaps adjust the teaching schedule to accommodate ranch needs." Emmett shook his head. The men's education is more important now than ever. If we lose this season's contracts, some may need to seek work elsewhere. Better they go with skills that increase their options. The practical wisdom of his perspective impressed Charlotte anew. Even facing potential financial ruin, Emmett prioritized his men's long-term welfare over immediate convenience. Thomas mentioned you might be selling some of the northern grazing land, she said carefully, uncertain whether she was overstepping. Boundaries. Word travels, Emmett remarked with a faint smile. Yes, I've had an offer from the Cunningham outfit across the valley. Not ideal, but it would provide enough capital to weather the current difficulties. Charlotte hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming in her mind. Have you considered other possibilities? Perhaps diversification rather than contraction? Emmett glanced at her with mild surprise. What sort of diversification does a Boston librarian have in mind for a Wyoming cattle ranch? The gentle teasing in his tone encouraged her to continue. I've been reading about agricultural developments. The books you recovered from storage, Catherine's collection, includes several forward-thinking volumes on sustainable ranching practices. Ooh, Catherine was always interested in new ideas, Emmett acknowledged, some too advanced for their time and place. Perhaps, Charlotte agreed, but times change. One of the volumes discusses supplementary crops that require minimal water but provide additional revenue streams. Another addresses breeding practices that produce hardier cattle for difficult conditions. Emmett was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. You've given this considerable thought. I believe in practical education, Charlotte replied, not just reading for its own sake, but knowledge applied to real challenges. Whispering Pines has given me purpose. It seems only fair to offer what insights I can in return. Later that week, Charlotte arrived for the regular lesson to find the schoolroom occupied not just by the ranch hands, but by Emmett himself. Catherine's agricultural books spread across the teacher's desk. I'd like to propose an additional subject, he said without preamble. If you're willing, I thought we might all benefit from studying these materials together. Less formal instruction, more collaborative investigation. The suggestion represented a significant shift. Emmett had always maintained a careful separation between ranch management and the educational program. His proposal implied not just respect for Charlotte's insights, but a willingness to reconsider established patterns. I'd be honored, she replied, genuinely moved by the request. What evolved over subsequent sessions was unlike anything Charlotte had experienced in formal education. The ranch hands contributed practical knowledge born of years working the land, while she guided their exploration of written resources and helped them articulate observations. Emmett brought his deep understanding of the region's particular challenges and opportunities, creating a unique fusion of academic and experiential learning. From these collaborative sessions emerged a plan that combined traditional ranching with strategic innovations. The northern section of land would indeed be sold, but the proceeds would fund a modest irrigation system for a portion of the remaining property, allowing for drought-resistant crop cultivation alongside reduced cattle operations. Several hands would be trained in new skills required for the diversified approach, with Jackson taking increased responsibility for numerical projections and record-keeping. As the plan took shape on paper, Charlotte found herself drawn more deeply into the life of Whispering Pines than she had anticipated. Her role had expanded beyond teaching basic literacy to become something more integral, part educator, part advisor, part stakeholder in the ranch's future. The evolution felt natural, a genuine expression of her abilities rather than an imposed limitation. One evening in late July, as summer heat lingered past sunset, Charlotte and Emmett remained in the schoolroom after the others had departed. Plans and calculations covered the slate board, the collaborative vision taking concrete form. "It might work," Emmett said, studying the figures with cautious optimism. "It's a significant departure from how my father ran things, but these aren't my father's times." "Change doesn't invalidate tradition," Charlotte observed. "It builds upon it." Emmett's gaze shifted from the slate to her face, his expression softening. "You've changed Whispering Pines, Charlotte. More than I expected when I first hired you to teach basic reading." It was the first time he had used her given name rather than the formal Miss Harlow, and the intimacy of it hung in the air between them. "The ranch has changed me too," she replied. "I came west, thinking education was something transmitted from teacher to student. I've learned it flows in all directions when people truly value knowledge." "Catherine used to say something similar," Emmett said, his voice carrying not sadness but warm remembrance. "That true learning happens in the space between people, not just in books or experience alone." Charlotte had come to appreciate these moments when he shared memories of Catherine, not as comparisons, but as connections, threads weaving past and present together. "She sounds like she understood education's deeper purpose." "She did," Emmett agreed, "and she would have approved of what you've built here. Not because it mirrors her approach, but because it carries the same spirit while being entirely your own creation." The compliment touched Charlotte deeply. "Thank you for allowing me the freedom to build it." Emmett moved toward the window, gazing out at the darkening ranch yard. "I've been thinking about your Saturday classes in town," he said, changing the subject with characteristic directness. "It seems inefficient for you to travel back and forth so frequently, particularly as we implement these new plans." Charlotte felt a flutter of concern. Despite the deepening connection with Whispering Pines, her town classes remained important, a bridge between communities and a fulfillment of her commitment to broader education. "Are you suggesting I should end them?" she asked carefully. Emmett turned back toward her, seeming surprised by the question. "Not at all. I'm suggesting we might establish something more permanent here at the ranch. A proper school building, large enough to accommodate both the ranch hands and any town children whose parents are willing to bring them out on Saturdays." The proposal was unexpected and thoughtful, a solution that would strengthen rather than divide her educational efforts. "You would build a schoolhouse for Saturday classes." "For regular classes," Emmett clarified. "If the diversification plan succeeds, Whispering Pines will need ongoing education, not just for the current hands, but for their families and others who might join the expanded operation. A dedicated schoolhouse seems a natural investment in the ranch's future." Charlotte absorbed the significance of his words. Emmett wasn't just accommodating her teaching. He was incorporating education into his vision for Whispering Pines itself, making it an essential element rather than an added benefit. "That's a remarkable proposal," she said finally. "But what about my lodgings in town?" "The distance would make daily teaching impractical." "There's Catherine's study in the main house," Emmett replied, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes held deeper meaning. "It could be converted to living quarters, if such an arrangement would be acceptable to you." The offer contained layers of significance beyond practical accommodation. Living at Whispering Pines would fundamentally alter her relationship with both the ranch and Pine Ridge town, shifting her primary allegiance and place in the community. More importantly, it would place her in closer daily proximity to Emmett himself, crossing boundaries that had been carefully maintained despite their growing connection. "That's a serious step," Charlotte said, meeting his gaze directly. "One that would certainly raise eyebrows in town." "It would," Emmett acknowledged, without pretense. Though a teacher residing on property where she instructs is hardly unprecedented, many rural schools provide living quarters for educators. "Is that all I would be?" Charlotte asked quietly. "A teacher residing on the property?" The directness of her question hung in the air between them. Emmett moved away from the window, closing the distance between them with deliberate steps. "No," he said simply, "that's not all you would be. Not to me, but I won't presume to define what else might develop between us. That should be determined through mutual choice, not necessity or convenience." The honesty of his response touched Charlotte deeply. Unlike so many in her experience, from her father to her former fiancé to Mrs. Montgomery, Emmett wasn't attempting to prescribe her role or place. He was offering possibility without demand, connection without constraint. "I need to consider this carefully," she said. "It's not a decision to make lightly." "I wouldn't respect it if you did," Emmett replied. "Take whatever time you need. The offer remains open regardless." As July melted into August, Charlotte found her thoughts increasingly occupied by Emmett's proposal. She continued her established routine, teaching at Whispering Pines 3 evenings weekly, conducting Saturday classes in town, maintaining careful neutrality in her interactions with both communities. Yet beneath this outward consistency, her internal deliberations intensified. The practical arguments for accepting were compelling. Living at Whispering Pines would eliminate exhausting travel, allow for expanded educational offerings, and provide a stability that her rented room in town lacked. The ranch's diversification plan was progressing well, with early irrigation work already underway and arrangements made for initial crop experiments the following spring. Yet Charlotte knew the decision extended far beyond practicality. It represented a definitive choice, not just about where she would teach, but where and how she would build her life. The implications for her relationship with Emmett loomed largest in her considerations, raising questions about what future they might forge together. Thomas Reed proved an invaluable sounding board as she worked through her thoughts. They had fallen into the habit of meeting Sunday afternoons at the creek's edge, conversations flowing as freely as the water beside them. "Emmett's not a man who makes offers lightly," Thomas observed during one such discussion, "especially not ones that involve Catherine's spaces." "I know," Charlotte replied. "That's part of what gives me pause. I don't want to replace her memory or erase her influence on the ranch." Thomas considered this thoughtfully. "I don't think that's what Emmett's asking. Catherine built something at Whispering Pines that mattered. Education, forward thinking, community beyond isolation. You've continued that work in your own distinct way. It's not replacement, but continuation of values they shared." "And what about Pine Ridge?" Charlotte asked. "Moving to the ranch would be seen as choosing sides." "Perhaps initially," Thomas acknowledged. "But your Saturday teaching creates a bridge that didn't exist before. Mrs. Montgomery and her circle may disapprove, but others might see opportunity in the connection." His balanced perspective helped Charlotte sort through complex feelings, though the ultimate decision remained hers alone. As August progressed, the immediate pressures of harvest preparation and educational planning provided welcome distraction from her unresolved questions. Then came the fire. It began in the early hours of a hot, dry morning. A lightning strike on the eastern slope that might have smoldered harmlessly had the summer not been so parched. By sunrise, the ranch hands spotted smoke rising from the pine forest that gave Whispering Pines its name. By mid-morning, flames were visible from Town, prompting Sheriff Winters to organize volunteer firefighters. Charlotte heard the news at her Saturday class, which dispersed immediately as fathers and older brothers joined the firefighting effort. Without conscious decision, she found herself climbing into Thomas Reed's wagon as he prepared to join those, heading toward the ranch. "You don't have to come," he said, though he made no move to stop her. "It'll be dangerous." "I know," Charlotte replied simply. The possibility of not going had never entered her mind. The journey to Whispering Pines had never seemed longer. As they approached, the extent of the danger became clear. Flames had swept down from the forest into the eastern pastures, moving steadily toward the main ranch buildings. A line of men fought the fire with wet blankets and shovels, attempting to create fire breaks while others evacuated livestock from threatened areas. Thomas joined the firefighting line immediately. Charlotte, after a moment's assessment, headed toward the ranch house, where she could see figures moving urgently in and out, carrying items to wagons positioned nearby. Emmett emerged from the house as she approached, his face streaked with soot, surprise registering briefly before he returned to immediate concerns. "We're evacuating valuables and records," he explained, not questioning her presence. "The schoolroom and bunkhouse are directly in the fire's path unless the wind shifts." Charlotte didn't waste time with words. She entered the house and began helping with the evacuation effort, prioritizing essential documents and irreplaceable items. The ranch hands' families worked alongside her, women she had met only briefly during her teaching, children wide-eyed with fear and excitement. As they worked, Charlotte found herself in Catherine's study, the room Emmett had suggested might become her quarters. Unlike the rest of the house, which balanced practicality with modest comfort, this space reflected more personal touches. Bookshelves lined the walls, a desk positioned to capture morning light, botanical drawings carefully framed beside maps of the region. It was a room created by a woman who valued knowledge and beauty equally. Charlotte began carefully packing books and papers, aware that she was handling another woman's legacy. As she worked, she came across a journal bound in faded blue leather. It fell open as she lifted it, revealing handwriting that flowed across the page with educated precision. The passage caught her eye not just for its content, but for its resonance. With her own experience, Whispering Pines demands everything: strength, patience, endless adaptation. Yet it returns these investments multiplied. I came west, seeking purpose beyond Boston's limitations. I found it not in escape, but in creation, building something that contains both what I brought and what this land teaches. Emmett understands this balance better than anyone. Together we are creating something neither of us could have imagined alone. Charlotte closed the journal carefully, adding it to the box of items to be evacuated. Catherine's words echoed in her thoughts as she continued working, offering unexpected clarity. The parallel between their journeys wasn't a constraint, but a connection. Two women who had found purpose in the same place while remaining true to their distinct identities. The evacuation continued through the afternoon as the firefighting efforts intensified. By evening, exhaustion had settled over everyone, but determination refused to yield. The wind had shifted slightly, slowing the fire's advance toward the main buildings, but the danger remained imminent. As darkness fell, Charlotte found herself standing beside Emmett at the edge of the ranch yard, watching the orange glow of flames illuminate the ridge beyond. "You should return to town with the next wagon," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. "It's not safe here." "I'm not leaving," Charlotte replied with quiet certainty. "Whispering Pines needs every hand available." Emmett studied, her face in the firelight seeming to recognize the futility of argument. "We might lose it all," he said finally. "The house, the outbuildings, everything we've worked for." "Then we'll rebuild," Charlotte responded without hesitation. "The use of we, deliberate and meaningful, but we haven't lost it yet." Something shifted in Emmett's expression, recognition of both her commitment and the choice it represented. Before he could respond, shouts from the firefighting line drew their attention. The wind had changed again, driving flames toward the newly constructed irrigation channel designed for the diversification plan. Through the night, Charlotte worked alongside everyone else, carrying water, preparing food for exhausted firefighters, helping tend minor burns and injuries. The fire reached the irrigation channel just before midnight, its advance slowed by the cleared ground and available water. By dawn, the immediate threat to the main buildings had diminished, though the fire continued to burn in more distant areas. As sunrise revealed the damage, Charlotte stood with Emmett surveying what remained. The eastern pastures were charred wasteland. The pine forest that had given the ranch its name was largely destroyed. The schoolroom and bunkhouse had suffered minor damage, but remained structurally sound. The main house stood untouched, though the smell of smoke permeated everything. "We saved the heart of it," Emmett said, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "The rest can be rebuilt or regrown." "Yes," Charlotte agreed simply. They worked through that day and the next, the crisis creating a temporary community as town and ranch people labored side by side. Mrs. Montgomery herself arrived with the Ladies' Aid Society, bringing food and supplies without her usual commentary. On propriety, Sheriff Winters coordinated ongoing firefighting efforts with remarkable efficiency. Even Mr. Peterson came from town, his injured arm in a sling, to offer what assistance he could. By the third day, the fire had been contained to remote areas where it would eventually burn itself out. The ranch hands began clearing debris and assessing livestock losses. Charlotte helped restore the schoolroom, determined that educational efforts would continue despite the setback. It was late afternoon when Emmett found her there, arranging books that had been hastily evacuated and now returned to their shelves. "You never left," he said, his tone somewhere between statement and question. Charlotte placed another volume on the shelf before turning to face him. "No, even when the fire was at its worst. Especially then." Emmett moved further into the room, his gaze steady on her face. "Why?" The question was simple but profound. Charlotte considered her answer carefully, aware that this moment represented a culmination of decisions long in formation. "Because this place matters to me," she said finally. "What we're building here, the education, the community, the future, it's become part of who I am. I couldn't leave any more than you could." "And now?" Emmett asked quietly. "Will you stay?" Charlotte thought of Catherine's journal entry, of Pine Ridge's limited vision for her life, of the journey that had brought her from Boston rejection to this smoke-scented schoolroom in Wyoming territory. Most of all, she thought of the man, standing before her, weathered but unwavering, offering possibility without prescription. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll stay." The word hung between them, weighted with all it implied, not just about living arrangements, but about shared purpose and mutual choice. Emmett closed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his with careful reverence. "I want to be clear," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not asking you to be Catherine's replacement or to fit a predetermined role. I'm asking you to be Charlotte Harlow, with all your education and determination, building something alongside me that neither of us might achieve alone." The declaration moved her deeply, an acknowledgement of her complete self rather than selected aspects. "That's the only role I would accept," she replied. "Partners in creation, not prescribed limitation." "Partners," Emmett echoed, the word carrying promise beyond its simple syllables. When he kissed her, it felt not like culmination, but beginning. The first page of a story they would write together, word by careful word, day by deliberate day. Outside the schoolroom window, the burned land already waited for renewal, just as Whispering Pines itself awaited the future they would build upon its tested foundations. In the weeks that followed, Charlotte's transition to Whispering Pines unfolded with surprising smoothness. Catherine's study became her living quarters, transformed with minimal changes that respected its original character while accommodating its new occupant. She divided her books between there and the schoolroom, creating spaces that reflected both private reflection and public education. Pine Ridge received news of her permanent move with mixed reactions. Mrs. Montgomery expressed predictable disappointment, wrapped in concern for Charlotte's reputation. Sheriff Winters offered pragmatic acceptance. Sarah Miller and several other parents committed to bringing their children to the expanded Saturday classes at the ranch, seeing opportunity where others perceived impropriety. Thomas Reed alone seemed genuinely pleased, his quiet support unwavering as Charlotte navigated her new position between communities. "You've created your own path," he observed during one of their now less frequent creekside conversations. "Neither fully Eastern nor Western, neither entirely traditional nor revolutionary, something distinctly your own." The observation captured what Charlotte had been working toward since leaving Boston. Not rejection of her past or uncritical embrace of frontier expectations, but synthesis of valuable elements from both into something authentic and purpose-driven. Emmett, too, was finding new balance. The fire had destroyed much, but had also cleared space for the diversification plans developed during their educational sessions. Rebuilding efforts incorporated these innovations from the beginning, creating infrastructure that supported both traditional ranching and new ventures. Their personal relationship developed with the same careful intentionality that characterized their professional collaboration. Emmett's natural reserve had not disappeared, but it had softened into thoughtful consideration rather than protective distance. Charlotte found in him a partner who valued her mind as much as her heart, who saw education not as threatening, but as essential to meaningful progress. One evening in late September, as autumn painted the recovering landscape in gold and amber, they sat together on the main house porch. The air carried the first hint of coming winter, a reminder that seasons changed regardless of human plans or preferences. "The first crop plantings will need to wait until spring," Emmett said, reviewing their ongoing preparations. "But the irrigation system should be completed before first snow." "And the new schoolhouse foundation is already laid," Charlotte added. "Jackson has shown remarkable aptitude for construction design. I never would have recognized his mathematical gifts in a traditional classroom setting." Emmett smiled, the expression coming more easily to him now. "You see potential others miss. It's a rare quality, as is your willingness to pursue that. Potential despite tradition," Charlotte returned. "Most ranchers would have dismissed these innovations as impractical or unnecessary." "Most ranchers haven't faced fire and drought in the same season," Emmett replied pragmatically. "Necessity often precedes innovation." Charlotte studied his profile in the fading light, appreciating the blend of practicality and vision that defined him. "Your father wouldn't have approved of these changes?" "My father believed ranching methods were perfected by his generation and required no improvement," Emmett said without bitterness. "He was a good man in his way, but limited by certainty." "And you?" Charlotte asked. "I've learned that certainty is less valuable than adaptability," Emmett replied, "though it took losing Catherine to teach me that lesson fully." Charlotte had come to understand that mentioning Catherine wasn't painful for Emmett, but necessary. Acknowledgement of influences that had shaped him and the ranch alike. "She seems to have been a woman who embraced evolution rather than fearing it." "She was," Emmett agreed. "As are you in your distinct way. I consider myself fortunate to have known two such women in one lifetime." The comparison no longer concerned Charlotte. She had found security in her own identity, confidence in the unique contribution she brought to Whispering Pines. Perhaps that's the true education the West offers, learning to build something new without discarding what remains valuable from the past. Emmett's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, their fingers intertwining with comfortable familiarity. "Is that what you found here? What you were seeking when you left Boston?" Charlotte considered the question carefully. "I left Boston because my place there had been taken from me. I came west, seeking any place that would accept me. What I found instead was the opportunity to create my own place, one defined by contribution rather than conformity, "And now?" Emmett asked, his tone suggesting the question carried deeper meaning than its simple words. "Now I've found home," Charlotte said simply. "Not because someone assigned it to me or because convention dictated it, but because I chose it with clear eyes and full understanding." Emmett's grip tightened slightly on her hand. "I'd like to make that home permanent," he said, his voice steady despite the significance of his words. "Not because convention expects it or because practicality suggests it, but because I've come to believe we're better together than apart." The proposal, characteristic in its straightforward sincerity, touched Charlotte deeply. "Are you asking me to marry you, Emmett Burke?" "I am," he confirmed. "Though I want to be clear, this isn't about replacing what was lost or fulfilling a predetermined role. It's about building something new together, something neither of us might create alone." Charlotte turned toward him fully, meeting his gaze with matching sincerity. "I would accept on no other terms. Not as Catherine's replacement or as the educated woman who exceeded Pine Ridge's expectations, but as myself, with all my ideas and independence intact." "I would offer on no other terms," Emmett replied with the hint of a smile. "A marriage of equals seems the only kind worth pursuing, particularly when one's prospective wife can quote agricultural treatises from memory and calculate irrigation requirements more accurately than most engineers." Charlotte laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch yard, where lights glowed in the bunkhouse and temporary quarters. Beyond these immediate buildings, the land stretched toward horizons, still dusty with ash, but already showing signs of renewal. "Yes," she said simply. "I will marry you, Emmett Burke, not because I was rejected elsewhere or because convention demands it, but because together we can build something worthy of both our pasts and our shared future." Their kiss sealed the agreement, a promise of partnership that transcended traditional boundaries. Above them, stars emerged in the darkening sky, constant yet ever-changing, like the land below and the lives unfolding upon it. When news of their engagement reached Pine Ridge, reactions followed predictable patterns. Mrs. Montgomery expressed concern wrapped in resignation. Sheriff Winters offered pragmatic congratulations, and Thomas Reed smiled with genuine pleasure. Sarah Miller organized a small celebration among families who had come to value Charlotte's expanded educational offerings, bridging town and ranch with characteristic warmth. The wedding itself reflected the couple's shared values, simple in execution, but rich in meaning. It took place in the nearly completed schoolhouse, the first official gathering in a building designed to unite communities rather than separate them. Thomas Reed stood as witness, his friendship having proved constant through all transitions. Ranch hands and town families sat side by side, their presence acknowledging the new connections being forged between previously separate worlds. Charlotte wore a dress of practical elegance, neither Eastern formal nor Western plain, but a thoughtful blend that suited her evolving identity. Emmett had abandoned his usual work clothes for a suit that respected the occasion's significance without pretense or discomfort. The vows they exchanged spoke not of obedience or prescribed roles, but of partnership, mutual respect, and shared purpose. When the simple ceremony concluded, the gathering celebrated with food and music that carried well into the evening, a community foundation for the union being established. Later, alone in the main house that would now be fully their shared home, Charlotte and Emmett stood by the study window. The land beyond lay blanketed in early winter moonlight, the burned areas now softened by snow, the promise of renewal waiting beneath frozen ground. "Was it what you imagined when you came west?" Emmett asked, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder. Charlotte considered the journey that had brought her from rejected mail-order bride to respected, educator and ranch partner. Nothing about this journey has followed expectation, she replied honestly. It's been infinitely more challenging and infinitely more rewarding than anything I could have imagined. Any regrets? Emmett's question carried no insecurity, only genuine interest in her perspective. Not regrets, Charlotte clarified. But I do think about the woman who arrived in Aspen Grove with a trunk of books and rejection waiting at the station. She couldn't have envisioned this outcome. No, Emmett agreed. Just as I couldn't have imagined this when I saw Catherine, sitting on that same station platform years ago, similarly rejected and uncertain. The parallel between their beginnings had long since transformed from shadow to foundation, acknowledgement of patterns that connected their stories without constraining their development. Perhaps that's the true lesson of the West, Charlotte suggested. Not that we must abandon our past to find future, but that unexpected beginnings can lead to unimaginable destinations when we remain true to our authentic selves. A lesson worth teaching in our new schoolhouse, Emmett observed. The first of many, Charlotte agreed, turning in his arms to face him fully. We have much to build together, Mr. Burke. Indeed we do, Mrs. Burke, he replied, the name both new and right on his lips. Indeed we do. Outside, the first gentle snow of winter continued falling, covering burned ground and fresh construction alike. Nature's reminder that renewal followed destruction, and new growth would emerge from tested soil when spring returned to Whispering Pines. The passing seasons brought steady growth to Whispering Pines Ranch. The diversification plans Charlotte and Emmett had developed proved remarkably successful, with drought-resistant crops providing stability when cattle markets fluctuated. The irrigation system expanded gradually each year, transforming previously vulnerable land into productive acreage that sustained both traditional ranching and innovative agriculture. The schoolhouse became the heart of a growing community. What had begun as evening lessons for ranch hands and Saturday classes for town children evolved into a respected educational center, serving families from throughout the region. Charlotte's approach to practical learning drew increasing attention, with occasional visitors traveling considerable distances to observe her methods. 5 years after their wedding, Charlotte stood at the schoolhouse door, watching children stream into the yard for the spring term. Among them was Julia Burke, her 4-year-old daughter, whose dark curls and thoughtful expression reflected both parents equally. The child carried a small book clutched in determined hands, already developing her mother's love of reading alongside her father's quiet persistence. Planning to start her Latin studies today? Emmett asked, joining Charlotte at the doorway. His tone carried the gentle humor that had deepened with their marriage, though his face remained weathered by outdoor work and responsibility. Perhaps next week, Charlotte replied with matching warmth. Today we're focusing on practical botany. The seedlings need tending in the greenhouse. The greenhouse had been Emmett's gift for their first anniversary, a glass-walled structure, adjacent to the schoolhouse where students learned sciences through direct application. Like everything at Whispering Pines, it balanced practicality with forward-thinking vision, producing both educational opportunities and tangible benefits for the ranch. Thomas is arriving this afternoon, Emmett noted. He's bringing the new forge equipment and staying through the weekend. Thomas Reed had become a regular visitor, his friendship with both Charlotte and Emmett deepening over the years. He had expanded his blacksmith shop in Pine Ridge to include agricultural tool design, often testing new implementations at Whispering Pines before offering them more widely. His presence bridged the remaining gaps between town and ranch, his steady friendship a constant in their evolving lives. We'll need his insight on the western irrigation extension, Charlotte observed. Jackson's calculations suggest we could increase efficiency by nearly 20% with proper equipment. They watched as Julia joined the other children gathering around the new assistant teacher, Anna Collins, once a shy ranch hand's wife, now a confident educator who had discovered her vocation through Charlotte's encouragement. The sight represented everything Charlotte had hoped to build: knowledge passed forward, abilities recognized regardless of background, community created through shared purpose. "Did you ever imagine this?" Emmett asked, his hand finding hers with practiced ease, "when you arrived in Wyoming territory with that rejection telegram?" Charlotte considered the question thoughtfully. "No," she admitted. "I couldn't have envisioned this particular life. I was too focused on what I'd lost to see what might be possible." "And now," Emmett prompted, "now I understand that rejection simply redirected me to where I truly belonged," Charlotte replied. "Not as someone else's vision of a suitable wife, but as a partner in creating something meaningful." Emmett nodded, his expression reflecting similar understanding. "Catherine used to say that the West doesn't change who we are. It just reveals it more clearly by stripping away pretense." The mention of his first wife came naturally now, a respected presence in their shared history rather than a shadow between them. Charlotte had long since recognized that Catherine's legacy at Whispering Pines had helped create the foundation upon which she and Emmett continued building, each adding distinct contributions to an evolving vision. "She was right," Charlotte agreed. "Though I think the revealing happens through connection as much as isolation. We discover ourselves through how we respond to challenges alongside others." From across the schoolyard, Julia waved enthusiastically at her parents before being drawn into a game with the other children. Her laughter carried clearly in the spring air, the sound of a child secure in belonging, untroubled by questions of proper place or purpose. "I need to prepare for class," Charlotte said, though she remained a moment longer, savoring the scene before her. "Will you join us for the greenhouse lesson?" "Wouldn't miss it," Emmett replied, "though I expect our daughter will inform me if my botanical knowledge proves inadequate." "Without question," Charlotte laughed. "She's developing quite definite opinions about proper education." Their shared amusement reflected deeper satisfaction, pride in their daughter's confidence and in the environment they had created where such confidence could flourish naturally. Julia would grow up understanding that education wasn't merely ornamental or strictly practical, but essential to meaningful contribution regardless of gender or circumstance. As Charlotte gathered her teaching materials, she glanced once more across the schoolyard toward the main ranch house beyond. The view encompassed everything she had helped build: the diversified fields, the expanded facilities, the community of learners and workers who shared common purpose despite varied backgrounds. She had arrived in Wyoming territory overeducated for conventional expectations, rejected for the very qualities that would ultimately prove most valuable. The journey from that initial rejection to her current fulfillment had required courage, adaptability, and the willingness to envision possibilities beyond traditional limitations. Most importantly, it had required finding those who recognized her true value, not despite her education, but because of how she applied it. In Emmett, in the ranch hands who had become colleagues, in Thomas's steadfast friendship, in the families who entrusted their children to her guidance, Charlotte had discovered the community she had never quite found in Boston's more formal society. The school bell rang, calling students to morning lessons. Charlotte moved toward her classroom with practiced purpose, ready to share knowledge that balanced timeless wisdom with practical application. Behind her, Emmett headed toward the fields where spring planting continued, each of them engaged in meaningful work that supported their shared vision. Between them, they had transformed rejection into foundation, challenge into opportunity, and separate journeys into shared purpose. The life they had built together stood as testament not just to their individual strengths, but to the power of recognizing value where others saw only inconvenience, in education, in adaptation, and in the courage to create something entirely new from tested elements of the past. The title that had once defined Charlotte's arrival in Wyoming territory, mail order bride rejected for being too educated, had long since given way to a different identity, one she had chosen rather than merely accepted: educator, innovator, partner, mother. At Whispering Pines Ranch, she had discovered that true value isn't assigned by others, but revealed through purpose fulfilled and challenges overcome. That was the lesson she taught each day, not just through words, but through living example. That education's true worth lies not in social expectation, but in how knowledge transforms into wisdom when applied with courage, adaptability, and clear-eyed purpose. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.